afternoon. My name is Robert Holub, and I'm Dean of the Undergraduate Division in the College of Letters and Science. I welcome you all here. It's really a pleasure for me today to be able to introduce to you today's speaker, Michael Pollan, who is Knight Professor in the School of Journalism and Director of the Knight Program in Science and Environmental Journalism. Professor Pollan was educated at Bennington College, Columbia, and Oxford. He has authored 3 books: Second Nature in 1991, A Place of My Own in 1997, and The Botany of Desire, A Plant's Eye View of the World, which appeared in 2001. That also received the Borders Book of the Year Award for the Best Non-Fictional Book of 2001, as well as a Best Book Award by the American Booksellers Association and Amazon.com. Since 1987, he's been a contributing editor to the New York Times Magazine, and he's written for numerous other periodicals, including Harper's, Vogue, and Mother Jones. Among his numerous awards are the John Burroughs Prize, the QPB New Vision Award for his first book, the 2000 Reuters IUCN Global Award for Environmental Journalism, the James Beard Award for the Best Magazine Series in 2003, and the 2003 Humane Society of the United States Genesis Award for his writings on animal agriculture. Now, all of these things, I'm sure, are very important to Professor Pollan. What was very important for me, however, was that he came up with something that was very important for my work. I work a lot on the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and he came up with a perfect illustration of Nietzsche's perspectivism. Many people think that perspectivism in Nietzsche is something like a kind of a liberal position that everyone has their own perspective, but it really isn't that. I've always believed that it involved a kind of a species view of things, and so now I can use Professor Pollan's book to illustrate what Nietzsche really meant by perspectivism, and that is that there is a human perspective on things, that we look at things in a certain way, but that other species may look at the world totally differently. And so it comes really through very well in his book, that in The Botany of Desire, that plants look upon the world in a quite different way than human beings look at the world. So I'm looking very forward today to eagerly to hear what Professor Pollan has to say. And I know that I'm not alone in having many questions to ask him. Here are 4 that pop into my mind. I want to know, for those of you who read The Botany of Desire, you'll recognize these questions. What do you think Johnny Appleseed enjoyed more, the fruit of the apple or the apple cider? Do you devote any space in your garden to tulips, and if so, what colors do you have? Did you ever eat those new leaf potatoes that you grew? And of course, a question that has no practical significance but only theoretical and scientific value: do you have any expert tips for growing the best marijuana? So with that, I'll turn the program over to Michael Pollan, and Steve Tollefson, who organizes the program, is going to be interviewing him. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'll get to the marijuana tips later. It's great to be here this afternoon. You took me away from the worst part of writing a book, which is having to do your notes and bibliography. And I'm at home going through stacks of books trying to remember MLA bibliographic form. So it's a great pleasure to be let out of the house. What we're going to do, the format is, Steve asked me if I would do a little reading first before we sat down to talk. And I thought what might be kind of fun to do was to read something from my new book, which actually I haven't taken out in public yet. It's coming out next April. It's called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And it's a book about food chains, the different food chains that we're a part of: industrial, organic, local, and hunter-gatherer. And so what I thought I would do is read from the first few pages of the book and give you a little bit of flavor of that. And as I said, I haven't read this aloud before, so I hope it works. The way the book is set up, it kind of starts macro and moves toward the micro, and it begins with the industrial food chain. And I use one plant to kind of wend my way through that food chain. Some of you can probably guess what it is, but it'll become clear pretty quickly. And this first little section is called A Naturalist in the Supermarket. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Air-conditioned, odorless, illuminated by buzzing fluorescent tubes, the American supermarket doesn't present itself as having very much to do with nature. And yet, what is this place, if not a landscape, man-made, it's true, teeming with plants and animals? Dead, it's true. I'm not just talking about the produce section or the meat counter either, the supermarket's flora and fauna. Ecologically speaking, these are this landscape's most legible zones, the places where it doesn't take a field guide to identify the resident species. Over there is your eggplant, onion, potato, and leek. Here, your apple, banana, and orange. Spritzed with morning dew every few minutes, produce is the only corner of the supermarket where we're apt to think, ah yes, the bounty of nature. Which probably explains why such a garden of fruits and vegetables, sometimes flowers too, is what usually greets the shopper coming through the automatic doors. Keep rolling back to the mirrored rear wall behind which the butchers toil, and you encounter a set of species only slightly harder to identify. There's chicken and turkey, lamb and cow and pig. Though in meat, the creaturely character of the species on display does seem to be fading as the cows and pigs increasingly come subdivided into boneless and bloodless geometrical cuts. In recent years, some of this supermarket euphemism has seeped into produce, where you'll now find formerly soil-encrusted potatoes cubed pristine white and baby carrots machine-lathed into neatly tapered cylinders. But in general, here in flora and fauna, you don't need to be a naturalist, much less a food scientist, to know what species you're tossing into your cart. Venture further, though, and you come to regions of the supermarket where the very notion of species seems increasingly obscure. The canyons of breakfast cereal and condiments, the freezer cases stacked with home meal replacements and bagged platonic peas, the broad expanses of soft drink and towering cliffs of snacks, the unclassifiable Pop-Tarts and Lunchables, the frankly synthetic coffee whiteners, and the Linnaeus-defying Twinkie. Plants, animals, though it might not always seem that way, even the deathless Twinkie is constructed out of, well, what precisely, I don't know offhand, but ultimately some sort of formerly living creature, i.e. a species. We haven't yet begun to synthesize our foods from petroleum, at least not directly. If you do manage to regard the supermarket through the eyes of a naturalist, your first impression is apt to be of its astounding diversity, biodiversity. Look how many different plants and animals and fungi are represented on this single acre of land. What forest or prairie could hope to match it? There must be 100 different species in the produce section alone, a handful more in the meat counter, and this diversity only appears to be growing. When I was a kid, you never saw a radicchio in the produce section, or a half a dozen different kinds of mushrooms, or kiwis, or passion fruit, and coquitos, and mangoes. Indeed, in the last few years, a whole catalog of exotic species from the tropics has colonized and considerably enlivened the produce department. Over in fauna, on a good day, you're apt to find, beyond beef, ostrich and quail, and even bison, while in fish you can catch not just salmon and shrimp, but catfish and tilapia too. Naturalists regard biodiversity as a measure of a landscape's health, and the modern supermarket's devotion to variety and choice would seem to reflect, perhaps even promote, precisely that sort of ecological vigor. Except for the salt and a handful of synthetic food additives, every edible item in the supermarket is a link in a food chain that begins with a particular plant growing in a specific patch of soil, or more seldom stretch of sea, somewhere on Earth. Sometimes, as in the produce section, that chain is fairly short and easy to follow. As the netted bag says, this potato was grown in Idaho, that onion came from a farm in Texas. Move over to meat, though, and that chain grows longer and less legible. The label doesn't mention that ribeye steak came from a steer born in South Dakota and fattened on a Kansas feedlot on grain grown in Iowa. Once you get into the processed foods, you have to be a fairly determined ecological detective to follow the intricate and increasingly obscure lines of connection linking the Twinkie or the non-dairy creamer to a plant growing in the earth someplace under the sun, but it can be done. So what exactly would an ecological detective set loose in an American supermarket discover, were he to trace the items in his shopping cart all the way back to the soil? This notion began to occupy me a few years ago after I realized that the straightforward question, what should I eat, could no longer be answered without first addressing two other even more straightforward questions. What am I eating? And where in the world did it come from? Not very long ago, an eater didn't need a journalist to answer these questions. The fact that today one so often does suggests a pretty good start on a working definition of industrial food. Quote, any food whose provenance is so complex or obscure that it requires expert help to ascertain. Unquote. When I started to follow the industrial food chain, the one that now feeds most of us most of the time and typically culminates either in a supermarket or fast food meal, I expected that my investigations would lead me to a wide variety of places. And though my journeys did take me to a great many states and covered a great many miles, at the very end of these food chains, which is to say at the very beginning, I invariably found myself in almost exactly the same place, a farm field in the American Corn Belt. The great edifice of variety and choice that is an American supermarket turns out to rest on a remarkably narrow biological foundation comprised of a tiny group of plants that is dominated by a single species, Zea mays, the giant tropical grass most Americans know as corn. Corn is what feeds the steer that becomes the steak. Corn feeds the chicken and the pig, the turkey and the lamb, the catfish and the tilapia, and increasingly even the salmon, a carnivore by nature that the fish farmers are re-engineering to tolerate corn. The eggs are made of corn. The milk and cheese and yogurt, which once came from dairy cows that grazed on grass, now come from Holsteins that spend their working lives indoors, tethered to machines, eating corn. Head over to the processed foods and you find ever more intricate manifestations of corn. A chicken nugget, for example, piles corn upon corn. What chicken it contains consists of corn, of course, but so does most of a nugget's other ingredients, including the modified corn starch that glues the thing together, the corn flour in the batter that coats it, and the corn oil in which it gets fried. Much less obviously, the leavenings and lecithin, the mono, di, and triglycerides, the attractive golden coloring, and even the citric acid that keeps the nugget fresh are all derivatives of corn. To wash down your chicken nugget with virtually any soft drink in the supermarket is to have some corn with your corn. Since the 1980s, virtually all the sodas and most of the fruit drinks sold in the supermarket have been sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. After water, corn sweetener is their principal ingredient. Grab a beer for your beverage instead, and you'll still be drinking corn in the form of alcohol fermented from glucose refined from corn. Read the ingredients on the label of any processed food, and provided you know the chemical names it travels under, corn is what you will find. For modified and unmodified starch, for glucose syrup and maltodextrin, for crystalline fructose and ascorbic acid, for lecithin and dextrose, lactic acid and lysine, for maltose and HFCS, for MSG and polyols, for the caramel color and xanthan gum, read corn. Corn is in the coffee whitener and cheese whiz, the frozen yogurt and TV dinner, the canned fruit and ketchup and candies, the soups and snacks and cake mixes, the frosting and gravy and frozen waffles, the syrups and hot sauces, the mayonnaise and mustard, the hot dogs and the bologna, the margarine and shortening, the salad dressings and the relishes, and even the vitamins. And yes, it's in the Twinkie too. There are some 30,000 items in the average American supermarket. Actually, this is a fact I checked today. 45,000 items in the average American supermarket. And more than a quarter of them now contain corn. This goes for the non-food items as well. Everything from the toothpaste and cosmetics to the disposable diapers, trash bags, cleansers, charcoal briquettes, matches, and batteries, right down to the shine on the cover of the magazine that catches your eye by the checkout, corn. Even in produce, on a day when there's ostensibly no corn for sale, you'll nevertheless find plenty of corn. In the vegetable wax that gives the cucumbers their sheen, and the pesticide responsible for the produce's perfection, even in the coating on the cardboard it was shipped in. Indeed, the supermarket itself, the wallboard and joint compound, the linoleum and fiberglass and adhesives out of which the building itself has been built is in no small measure a manifestation of corn. And us, and that's where I'm going to stop, but maybe we can talk about it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Steve's going to join me over here. Doesn't someone need to introduce you?
I'm Steve Tollefson. That's all you need to know. Whenever I do these, I spend a lot of time trying to think out how to begin. You know, what's the question to get things going in the right way. But I've changed all that because I want to talk, since you're in the middle of a book, I want to talk about the process. And so, for instance, who has already read what we heard today?
Let's see. A very small number of people, actually. My wife is my first reader. She's a painter named Judith Belzer, who is one of those rare creatures now in our culture, which is someone who reads books strictly for pleasure and buys books for pleasure. And so she's a very reliable reader. My editor at Penguin, his name is Ann Godoff. My agent, the copy editor, who's just returned the manuscript to me. And let's see if there's anybody else. Well, they may have passed it around the publishing house.
So when did you know that you were going to hand it off to them? When did you feel, do you have some innate sense of when you're going to give it to someone to read? And that sort of gets into the question of, so how much have you revised this thing?
Well, you know, the way I work is kind of funny. By the time I get to the end of a draft of a book, it's almost done. But along the way, I revise from the beginning almost every day of each chapter. So what you will find as a result is, you know, it's like a piece of furniture that's been like sanded a lot more at one point, but not at another point. So as you go on in the book, as you go on in each chapter, I'm sure you would find that the writing gets a little bit less refined. But the beginnings are highly polished. Because I can't start working every morning without going back and reading from the beginning, and once you do that, you can't stop but make changes. So there's a process of continual revision, and then sometimes I get somewhere that necessitates me to rewrite the beginning, and then I'll go back and rewrite that beginning, and then start that sanding process over and over again.
You made me think of several questions all at once. Where do I go from here? So when did you start this book? Because you said it's coming out in April.
Yeah, it's coming out in April. I've been writing it for about 3 years, but I really started on it about 5 years ago, and I started writing about food. And I didn't know at the beginning I was going to do a book on food, but I guess it was right after I finished Botany of Desire. My editor at the Times, a very talented editor named Gerald Marzorati, who's now the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, said, "We'd really like you to write about food for a couple of years and make this your beat." And I had only written one thing on the subject, the last chapter of Botany of Desire about the potato, and there was some other food stuff in that book. And so I thought it might be interesting to try. And I wrote this piece on beef, you know, telling the life story of this steer that I bought. And that kind of made me realize, and that introduced me to corn as a very important part of the American food chain, actually, in the process of doing that. So as I did a series of these pieces, I realized there was a book in it, and I wanted to do a book. So, you know, without knowing it, I started on it 5 years ago, but intensively 3 years ago.
So I want to come back to the article on beef. Is that Power Steer?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I want to ask, so if the book is coming out in April, is the manuscript primarily done at this point, and you're polish, you're sanding?
I'm doing a kind of final. I'm going over the copy editor's change. What happens is when you submit a book for publication to a trade press, this may be different in an academic press, but to a trade press, you get your comments from your editor, asking you to cut this, add this, you know, answer this question. Then you get a copy editor's queries. Copy editor goes through the whole manuscript and in a very detailed way makes lots of little changes for language, and you're dealing with her queries or his queries in the margins. So I've been doing that for the last couple of weeks. This one was unusual, that the publication of this is a little bit hasty by past standards, at least for me. I only handed in the book at Labor Day, and it's being published in April, so I actually had to collapse the editor's comments and the copy editors into one big pass, and fact-checking. This book has just an ungodly number of facts in it, I'm realizing, and there are at least 4 people on this campus currently occupied trying to make sure they're all true.
That doesn't bother most of us. Are you when people give you the comments, are you a happy recipient of comments?
Well, it depends what the comments are. Great, wonderful, brilliant. Go ahead and publish. I'm very happy. Needs work. Don't understand this. Don't buy this. You know, I'm less happy. But it's very important. And I've been very fortunate in that, you know, you hear about what's happened to publishing in New York, and everybody's moving around, and nobody has any continuity. I've been with the same editor for all 4 of my books, even though she's been fired and hired and fired and hired. You know, she's been in 4 different publishers, 3 different publishers over that period. So I've had continuity, and my agent too. I have a wonderful agent who I've worked with for all 4, and agents are surprisingly important in the criticism department, and they're much blunter actually than editors, because they're not afraid of losing you. And I've had my agent. I mean, I've given her a book proposal, and she's very blunt, and she doesn't say hello when she starts a phone conversation. I'll pick up the phone, and there will be her voice, and she'll be saying, "Boring, boring, boring." So I count on that, as painful as it sometimes is.
That actually, you know, there are a number of students I know here from some writing classes, so I guess you should thank your lucky stars that someone isn't writing that on your papers. Or maybe they are.
Yeah,
maybe
I know.
they are.
I've never written that on a student's papers. I'm much gentler to students than editors have been with me. But again, my editor too, she's very polite though. She's very different. But it's, you know, all of us though, the fact is most editors in New York don't have the time they once did to carefully go over every sentence of a manuscript. And my editor doesn't do that. I mean, she's very much a forest for the trees kind of person. And she's very good with framing issues, spotting, you know, errors in logic or coherence, and but she's not going over every sentence. And so for help with the writing and that kind of stuff, we all depend on a very small group of friends, and we exchange these very large favors. You know, that I'll read, you know, your book and you'll read my book, and that's a big undertaking. So I actually get a lot of help from. There's an old friend of mine who's a literary critic in Virginia named Mark Edmondson, and he's read all my books, and I read all his books. And his are harder to read than mine, it's true, but I still feel it's a good deal.
So I assume you didn't mean that as an invitation. I can imagine afterwards people coming up to you and saying, well, you said you would read my book.
No,
okay.
No. But I figured out a real trick. I've got a friend who's a filmmaker who formerly was a very good editor. And I've asked him to read it, and he'll never ask me to read his book. I'll just have to look at a tape of, you know, an hour or so. So I think that's a very good deal.
So the business about editors actually leads into a question that I did want to ask. So you've been an editor. You were an editor first, actually, at Harper's, an executive editor, and then you did a lot of editing at New York Times Magazine. Then you really took off on the writing, and then you've come here and you've been a professor and you've taught writing. I've looked at some of your syllabi for your courses. So the question is, what sins of editors are you making up for now that you're a writer? And by the same token, what sins of writers do you see from an editorial standpoint? And how does this all translate to your students? That's an easy question.
Yeah, see if I can unpack that one. Well, I think I really learned to write as an editor. I got more from my years at Harper's than just about anything else. And the reason is, I think a real key to writing is watching how another writer actually goes through the process, draft after draft after draft. One of the things that really struck me when I got to Harper's was that many, you know, well-known writers who were heroes of mine actually handed in drafts that still needed a lot of work. And that they, for the most part, liked editing. And that I would watch them go through. You know, when you edit an article in a magazine and you're responsible for that article, you read it 7, 8, 10 times at every different stage of production. Just to read anything that many times will teach you a lot about writing. And to watch the changes that the writer goes through and the kind of dialectical process of him or her either taking criticism or refusing to take criticism was very instructive. Plus, I was working with very good writers. Lewis Lapham, who's a very good editor. Jerry Marzorati actually worked there at the time. And I learned a lot about structure, and I learned a lot about storytelling. So I think that was really key. I became an editor basically not because I thought I loved editing so much, although I liked magazines. I liked the whole world of magazines. But because I didn't think it was realistic to think you could be a writer and make a living. I really thought that that was an outrageous ambition, and not, that I was going to fail if I tried that. And so I thought the next best thing was to be a magazine editor and be around writing and work on writing, do a little bit of writing. And I also did like the whole process of creating an issue of a magazine. I mean, that becomes kind of your form. You have all these levers. It's another way of experiencing and representing the world to other people, is editing a magazine. So it came as a real surprise to me after I've been writing for a long time that I kind of figured out I could make a living at it. Not a great living and not a very stable living, but nevertheless, once I found my subjects, I found that I had an audience, and that was very gratifying. I mean, not all the books I've written have been things I could live on, but some of them have.
So when you said about a magazine being a way of shaping the world, actually in the syllabus for your course, which by the way one of his courses is called Editor as God.
Tongue in cheek.
I thought it was, okay, I have to take all my questions back then. In the syllabus you talk about how a magazine edits or organizes the world for the reader. So do your books do the same thing?
Well, the piece of the world I'm dealing with. I mean, I think what I'm trying to do in a lot of my books, and this is retrospective, you don't know it when you're doing it, is really just try to figure out, and I think all writers have a set of sort of final questions. I mean, the things that at the end of the whole process they really want answers to. And for me, it really has to do with how we fit into nature. How are we like and unlike all the other creatures out there? How should we behave toward them? What can we learn from them about ourselves to help define ourselves? And one of the interesting things that happens to a writer is figuring out, a nonfiction writer, I guess any writer, is figuring out what you write about. In other words, after I did my first book, and that was Second Nature, and it was a book about gardening ostensibly, but really about environmental philosophy. And I thought, okay, I wrote a book about gardening. I was very interested in that and this whole subject of nature. Now I'm going to do something different. And so I thought, I'll do something on architecture. That seems really different. But as I got through that, I realized, oh, that's about nature too. And then I realized I'm really interested in these kind of crossing points between the natural world and the world of culture. And architecture is another one. Gardening is another one. These are places where our world and nature's world, if we can make that distinction temporarily, come together. And then I realized, well, I guess I'm sort of a nature writer, but I just go somewhere else. I don't go to the woods. I don't like to camp,
You make that clear in your book.
I described my dad at one point as the great indoorsman, and I'm not, quite that housebound, but so over time you realize that you do have these obsessions and that you keep coming at it. And food, of course, is another place where we, and this book is very much about looking at food as a naturalist might look at, or look at eating as a naturalist might look at it.
So let's skip to your dad for a moment. On your program, I forgot to give you a program, so you'll just have to wing this. There is a quote from Second Nature about his father. And it's really not, the question isn't about your father, it's about something else, but let me read this. I remember him strictly as an indoor dad, moving around the house in his year-round uniform of button-down shirt, black socks, and the shoes and boxer shorts. Tie shoes and boxer shorts. Maybe it was the fact he hated to wear pants that kept him indoors, or perhaps the boxers were a way to avoid having to go outside. Either way, my mother was left with the choice of her husband doing the yard work in his underwear or not doing it at all, which in the suburbs is not much of a choice. And then if we skip to the back from a place of my own, I'm petrified of chainsaws, a phobia I don't regard as irrational or neurotic in the least. It is in fact scientific, being grounded in the laws of probability and the empirical fact of my innate clumsiness and haste in dealing with the physical world. The way I see it, there is only a fixed number of times, unknowable but certainly not large, that I can expect to use a chainsaw before I become the victim of a blood-spurting and possibly life-threatening accident. So the question is really about your use of humor, which we heard in the section today. The books vary tremendously, I notice. In Botany of Desire, there's not as much. The most seems to be in Second Nature. Lots of hilarious things. There's a description of the white flower farm that makes friends of mine fall off their chairs in hysteria. You do all different kinds of humor, except slapstick. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people think that these are not books that should have humor in them.
Well, you know, that whole tradition of American writing about nature is so pious. And it's one of the things, although, you know, Thoreau gets off some jokes in Walden, actually. Mostly,
Could you remind us of any of them? I just can't remember one, but...
Oh, there's some puns, and no, he has a couple funny lines. I can't remember any of them, actually. But, you know, it's part of my whole problem with that whole tradition of Americans writing about nature. It's essentially a subset of, you know, religious writing. And there is a lot of comedy. I love doing humorous writing. I love creating opportunities to do it. I go out of my way to create those opportunities. There are parts of this book that don't have a lot of humor, which, you know, I find, you know, it's very hard to be funny about industrial agriculture. Although I try. I try in a few places. But on the other hand, a lot of the humor I get is from doing the sort of participatory journalism that I like to do. And I really learned how to do this, I think, from George Plimpton, who I don't know if people really read George Plimpton very much, but one of the books that really influenced me as a kid was Paper Lion, which I think came out when I was 11 or 12, and it was his account of playing football for the Detroit Lions. They let him play in a scrimmage game and go through spring training. And it's, you know, one of the great works of sports writing. And the reason is that he gets past that sports writer's persona as the kind of hard-bitten, cynical guy on the sidelines. And he's there. And it gives him an appreciation of the work of playing football. And it gives him incredible opportunities for humor, self-deprecating humor. Because, I mean, talk about slapstick, there's some real slapstick there. I just found that, you know, by doing things you're really not equipped to do, such as building a house, in this book I go hunting, and I'm really not equipped to do that. You not only gain a perspective that is much more valuable than the normal journalist's or sports writer's perspective, but you also create a persona for yourself that I think is easier for people to connect with. I don't think people connect with journalists at all. I don't think people like journalists, but they do like ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So a lot of it is how you build your first person. But you know, writing a funny sentence is what gives me the most pleasure writing, by far.
It gives us a lot of pleasure too, I think, in this. So you just said something about the persona, and again, I notice in the syllabus for your classes, you talk about I, the use of I. So are you telling me now and crushing me that I didn't actually read Michael Pollan all the way through these books? There's a persona, Michael Pollan, that's different from the real one?
Yes and no. I mean, in many ways, I think all first persons are created things to a certain extent, because we have a lot of different. We each have a lot of different first persons that we could use. Sometimes I write as a man. Sometimes I write as a Jew. Sometimes I write as a you know, guy who's never been hunting before. Sometimes I write as a meat eater. Sometimes I write as a vegetarian. I mean, so they're all true. You know, we're plural. We have a lot of selves, and when we're choosing who we're writing as, whatever's appropriate to the subject, we're exaggerating one of those selves. We're making that the center. But we don't write as our whole selves, I don't think, ever. You know, Janet Malcolm, there's a wonderful book on writing and journalism, and wonderful and outrageous, called The Journalist and the Murderer. And she basically says, you know, that the one place in all nonfiction where you find fiction is in the first person, is in the point of view of the narrator, which is a created thing. Even if you're writing New York Times, straight front page journalist, you're writing as that omniscient, all-knowing, been around, worldly character. That's not you. You're borrowing that from the Times. So yeah, I think I think the first person and even the third person is largely invented.
So that, all my questions are going down the drain, thanks to you. So that does bring up the piece I mentioned to you just when we met today, from 1980. You knew the date, I didn't. 1981, Keeping
Something
Television
like that.
Regulated. So this is an op-ed piece called Keeping Television Regulated, which I was fascinated with because, of course, the topic is different from the kind we're used to reading about. So very straightforward, very straightforward. I read it long after I'd read a lot of other pieces, so I was looking for the little joke, looking for the little joke, looking for the image, because I want to ask you about metaphors and symbols. You like some of those. So very straightforward. So is this yet another persona, or has your writing changed?
Well,
this is 20-some years ago.
Yeah, this is a long
25
time
years ago. As your writing evolved.
At the time, I was writing about television. I wasn't writing about nature. I hadn't found my subject yet. I had a job, and you have to remember, a lot of this is done for very practical reasons. It's only been recently that I'm in the bosom of the academy where I can just write about anything I want. I wrote to make a living, and I had a job working in a magazine called Channels of Communications, long gone. It was a magazine about television and cable and all the different television technologies that were kind of converging in the early 80s. That's where this piece, and I wrote a piece, the fairness doctrine under the Reagan administration was about to be repealed, and which I thought was a really bad idea, and the equal time rule too, I think. And so that was just another life when I wrote about that. I found it was interesting. I worked very hard writing about television. I did regulatory issues, but I wrote about the content of television. I wrote, serious pieces on Miami Vice and stuff like that. And what I discovered very quickly is nobody cared, and that the community of book readers or readers and the community of people who watch television, even though in fact they intersect, as people don't want to read really about television, even if they watch it. And then there are tons of people who watch television who don't want to read. So I just found I would send these pieces out into the world, and I wouldn't hear anything back. There's a process that happens writing anywhere, but especially writing popularly, where you get this feedback. You drop the stone in the water, and then the ripples go out, and some of them come back to you. And there were no ripples when I wrote about television, by and large. And it really wasn't. It's funny. It was when I started writing about gardening that I finally had this sense that somebody was out there paying attention. And that was incredibly gratifying. I mean, I would get mail, I'd get letters. I never got letters about Miami Vice. Don Johnson never wrote me.
Not even Melanie? So you spent one whole book building, and 2 years, I think, 2 years building a writing place. I don't know quite what to call it, a writing place, and wrote a fascinating book about it, and then moved to California. So have you found a writing place here? How important is that for you to have a place? Do you think it is important for a writer? Can you write anywhere?
Well, I've learned I can write anywhere. At certain points in a project, I can write, on the subway. I'm just so in it. But I did build this place. It was several years ago that I built it. That book came out in '97. I think I started building it in '92 or '93. And it was this small, sweet little space. It's about 8 by 12, 8 by 13. And I wrote that book and Botany of Desire in that space. And I miss it sorely. I really do. I had dreams of putting it on a truck and bringing it to California. But it's so site-specific and so heavy that I don't think I can do that. And one of the things that's been hardest about being here rather than there, it was a very hard decision for us to pull up stakes and move to California because we were very rooted in this piece of property. I'd basically 3 books had come out of this garden there. And we had, my wife and I, and she paints landscapes, so she had done, most of her work was tied to this place. And we had done, you know, this was a really cruddy little farmhouse that we bought in '83 for like $68,000 that we just put lots of sweat in and rebuilt several times and made this garden. And so it was very hard to turn our back on this. And in fact, we haven't entirely. I mean, we still dream of going back to it and we haven't sold it. But I haven't had a great writing place since then. You know, that's just Berkeley real estate, though. So I hope to, but I've managed to get a book written without it.
So in a place of my own, in particular, you cover just immense territory. I mean, if you start reading this book and you think it's going to be about building this place, yeah, it's about building the place, but it's about everything in the world. And I'm thinking of, as a writing teacher, I'm always telling students, you know, narrow your focus, and I assume that that's something in journalism you want people to narrow. And in this case, you really don't, right? You go off on architecture. I learned so much about history of architecture, I mean, even an upright post. There was a description of the history and significance of upright posts that went on for about 10 pages, all of which was fascinating. So, is that something anyone, I mean, can do? Does that take something particular to, because all the books do that, right? I mean, to a greater or lesser degree.
This book to a much lesser degree. I think I really like small subjects, and then being able to make them bigger. In other words, you know, have opportunities for digression. I love digressions in writing, you know, good digressions that don't go on too long. You have to really know when to stop, and I don't want to recommend your students do more digressions, but they really are the best parts in nonfiction. So if I picked suitably small topics like my garden or building this little inconsequential building in many ways, there were these opportunities, you know, to talk about windows. And when I talked about windows, to talk about, you know, Renaissance painting and views and perspectivism and all this kind of stuff. I love that. When you get a big topic like the whole food system, you don't get those opportunities. There's no time to digress. There's so much material. I actually realize as a writer I like having kind of less material rather than more, because then you fill that space with your own reflections and connections to things you've read. And that's one of the things I like about the essay as a form, that it's a digressive form in many ways. I like that kind of small topic, and I am always encouraging my students to find the microcosm. Start with the microcosm. Go in through the smallest door you can find, and then you can do other things. I like the miniature in a lot of ways.
Something in what you said made me think of what's clearly a love of language that you have. You know, some authors are really mostly focused or entirely focused on the subject, and there's clearly a combination of the writing about the subject. And I want to quote from a couple of things you said about words, and then let you talk about them. In a place of my own. By building this house off in the woods and by making it with my own hands, I had hoped to break out of a few of the panes of words that boxed in so much of my time and attention and seemed to distance me from the world of things and senses. And then earlier in the book you say, straight and plumb, square and level, right and true. To someone like me who can always see at least two sides of every issue, who spends his days in the company of words he dearly loves but knows better than to trust, these concepts glistened in the light of an obsolete but still longed-for century. But then you turn around and put everything in words for us.
Yeah, I am. I'm a creature of words, but always struggling to get past them, I think. You know, Walden was a huge influence on me, and a lot of that book is about finding something harder and more real at the bottom of all the opinion and ideology and words out there. And I'm always kind of, you know, I'm curious about that. I'm interested in that philosophical problem. I'm interested in experiences that kind of penetrate that cloud of words that's all around us. Even though I love the words, I'm not hostile to them. But as a writer, you know how imperfect they are. You know how they kind of jerk you around. They take you places you weren't trying to go. They have their own kind of specific gravity, and and they're never exactly right.
So then why? Then why I wasn't going to ask you this question. Then why in the world did you not give us some pictures? One of the most frustrating things about the book about building is that there is never, unless the cover is...
The cover is.
The
paperback cover is.
The paperback cover is... So, and I assume there's some up there where you can see that's the only picture of the building.
There are drawings. There's some drawings.
There's some drawings, and there are architectural drawings of detail. So,
yeah.
My question is,
it's funny. I went through the same thing on this book because somebody read it and said there's some characters in it. There's a couple farmers and a forager who are kind of my Virgils to these different food chains. And said, we really want to see these guys. And I said, no, I really don't think that pictures belong in this kind of book. I think if the words don't do it, sorry. And I also think that, there is some sense in which I change whatever I'm writing about, just a little bit. And I want to control your perception of it in a way that, pictures wouldn't. I wanted you to imagine your own place and not be so bound in my place. When I'm writing a profile of someone, I'm creating a character. Even though it's every fact in it is true. I don't want to leave the impression I make all this stuff up. But even so, a profile is one version of somebody, and that's the version I want to colonize your brain when you're reading this, and I'm not going to give you any out.
Well, you forced me to Google.
Actually, though, I am going to put pictures of the building because so many people have asked on my website. So, I'm not hiding them. It really exists.
In the book, he refers to some other significant buildings, and some of which I knew, but one I couldn't remember, so I had to Google Vanaventuri's house. And I must say, from what you just said, your description is much better than the house itself.
Well, we do. I mean, there is a sense in which we mythologize when we write about something a little bit, and that's what but that's what we want.
The other place when that was very strong for me was in Botany of Desire, when I really was desperate to see a Semper Augustus tulip, and discovered, as you say, that there are very few images of them around. Reading, you've already talked a little bit about reading, but you talk about it quite a bit in the book. I confess that part of the appeal for me of first gardening and then carpentry were the vast new uncharted realms of print. It's not easy getting past words. And you mentioned about sorting through things. So when you start one of these books, a lot of it is new territory for you, and so you're not just relying, and you have to go out and search.
Yeah, I like to start on a subject pretty green. Talk about persona. The persona I'm comfortable with is the amateur's persona. And I don't like writing as an expert. And when I become an expert on something, it kind of complicates things as a writer. And sometimes I pretend to a little bit more ignorance than I actually have. But all my books, two of them have education in the subtitle, I think, are educations. And that's the story any writer has. It's the story of his or her learning about the subject. I do love starting on a new topic. And whenever I start an article or a book, I make a reading list of all the things that could conceivably be connected to this that would be fun to read. And I love that. I love reading that, purposefully, hoping to get material, get an idea, get a digression. And I go to my friends and ask for people who knew things about different subjects. I'm learning all about corn. What should I read on corn? And there were some people on this campus who were really helpful. One of the things I like about being in a university is some really good people to ask what you should read on any subject. And my reading lists are much longer than they ever were before. So yeah, I like to learn things so I can read.
That reminds me that in the two books that have what we would call works cited, and you call sources, those are almost as enjoyable to read as the books, because you don't just list sources, you comment on, here are some books that I really like that have to do with this and that. And it was fun to see what sorts of things the rest of us could read. Can I talk about audience? I think it's easier if I just quote a couple of things to get into my question. So second nature, like Hester Prynne, he claimed not to need their consecration for his actions. Think of his initials in the front lawn as a kind of emerald letter. In your reading today, you referred to the Linnaeus-defying Twinkie. And then one of my favorite in second nature is, I have a nightmare vision of a broad lawn upon which whale pants from Brooks and wrap skirts from Talbots come and go, talking of Gertrude Jekyll. So for those of you who aren't laughing out loud, that's like a triple whammy of 2 clothing stores, the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock, and famous garden writer all in one. So the question is, when you do things like this, not everyone in your audience, and you do those a lot, not everyone in your audience gets them. Do you care that they don't get them? And who do you envision your audience to be?
You know, I kind of see it as kind of a hypertext situation where if I'm making an allusion like that, I try to write it in such a way that it would just go by if you didn't know it and not bother you. Maybe the Linnaeus-defying Twinkie will stop some people, but you got Twinkie after it. You know, that's the last thing you've heard. You'll keep going. You know, the Linnaeus is in the modifier, not in the. So I kind of, you know, sometimes I like to be playful that way and allude to things that only part of the readership is bound to get. But you have to remember, I was operating with a very tiny readership until Botany of Desire came out, so I could kind of assume that I was talking to 10,000 people. And now I'm talking to a somewhat larger group, but I hope. But I find it satisfying if you can do it in a way that doesn't make people feel inadequate about what they haven't read. So I don't know who my audience is. I don't have a clear sense. You know, I hear from all different kinds of people. I'm really surprised. I hear from lots of young people about Botany of Desire, which is great. Because I used to have a readership that, you know, was always depressingly elderly, you know, especially when I was
no offense to anyone here.
Well, I say depressing in terms of, you know, being at the beginning of hopefully a long career. And, you know, I wrote this book, Second Nature, and the kind of people who came out of the woodwork wouldn't be around for my 5th book. And so I'm happy to have younger readers.
I'm trying to think if we need to get out of that one quickly.
I do try to write for the general reader, though. I mean, I don't assume a lot of knowledge, say, about food or about gardening. It's not the garden stuff is not that inside. Since I'm an amateur, since I'm coming at it not as an expert, I'm trying hard. It really satisfies me to get people who couldn't care less about gardening to read one of my essays, or just are so not interested in food that they'd read one of my food pieces. That's very satisfying to me. One of the reasons I like using this friend Mark Evanson as a sounding board is all my topics he doesn't care about at all. He really is not interested at all. And so if I can keep him interested, that's good.
So I have I'm so desperately afraid of running out of time, and I have some sort of more detailed questions about writing. It's sort of a category I call writer's choices. And on the sheet again, this is going to seem awfully picky to some people, I suppose. I put 2 quotations that both use ellipses. And they're both wonderful. As for the prized new trait of continual bloom, that too can be seen as a form of sublimation, for the hybrid roses don't give more bloom. Really, they just parcel their blossoms out over a long period. They save and reinvest. So instead of abandoning herself to one great climax of bloom, the rose now doles out her blossoms one by one, always holding back. I can't read this the right way, can I? I'm not reading it with the right, always holding back.
A little more purple.
I know, I was one by one, always holding back.
This is romance writing.
I know. You can see I haven't read enough. Forever on the verge, never quite finishing. And then the other one.
The ellipses before finishing.
Yeah. Right. I'm assuming people are able to follow, maybe not. Since then, sweetness has lost much of its power and become slightly, ellipses, well, saccharine. So, you know, most people use ellipses completely badly. In the wrong places. This is 2 examples, completely different uses. Talk about tiny grammar things like this.
Is that a grammar thing?
It's
kind
a
of
style
it's
grammar.
kind of building a pause.
So
And
it's
in the
style.
first instance, it was kind of that dissolve during the sex scene in a 30s movie, you know, where you kind of go soft focus.
So how did that? I don't know if you can reconstruct.
A lot of it comes
Thinking
from
of that.
trying to read aloud.
Yeah.
I mean, I really do hear what when I describe that process of going back to the beginning and reading from the beginning and starting to revise, I don't move my lips anymore. I used to, but I really am hearing it. And I think the key to good prose is actually hearing your writing. And I tell my students to read aloud what they're writing. And you will find so many mistakes, and you will find so many awkwardnesses that you didn't realize were there. Reading is a physical process. It's tied to our breathing. There are places where you need a breath. Or you want to deny the place for a breath, as I did on those long lists of food additives, to make you breathless. So you're dealing with people's physical being. When you're reading. If you read well, I mean, some of us can read very abstractly, just for information, or speed reading. And in fact, I'm a slow reader, and I think part of the reason is that I do hear what I'm reading usually. And I know in a sentence if I'm in the hands of a writer who has a voice and has a physical dimension to their work, that I can feel it or hear it. So sometimes you can hear what you want to get at, and you can hear you need a pause, or you want to slow people down, and that's when you might use an ellipse for a big pause. I mean, a comma would give you a little one, but an ellipse is just, let's draw this out for a little bit. Or let's change our point of view. Let's pause long enough to reconsider and go, oh, look at it from here. So sometimes an ellipse will do that. A dash can do that too. They all have, the longer you're reading and writing, all these different marks have different personalities, and hopefully your sense of their personality meshes with the audience, or you're not a good writer. So that I know that a dash on the page suggests a certain something that an ellipses doesn't. And I don't know that I could articulate what that is, but they definitely have different personalities.
And the point of all that seems to be that you really are extremely attentive to the rhetorical aspect of your writing, to how even small parts are coming across on the page, because they reinforce the larger point. Is that?
Yeah, I guess so, and because I enjoy that. I do care about it. I mean, I come at this, I was an English major, and I did tons of close reading and love literature. So I love the closely grained work of revision.
So we're similes and metaphors. Let's do that, and then I'll save the off-color one for the end. You use lots of metaphors and similes. There's a great one somewhere about tulips. Tulips glide past our, wish I had it somewhere. Tulips glide past our consciousness like models on a runway. So what is the role? Can we overdo? I noticed in your course you ask students to go through and look for dying metaphors and bad images in prose. How do you know if you have a good one?
I don't know. It just feels fresh to you, and it feels right. There is, what you're worried about is, stale language, what Orwell wrote about, and Strunk and White write about. I mean, these shop-worn metaphors that just, the first thing that comes off the shelf, basically, is the one to watch out for. So sometimes you'll sit there for a long time, because that I was trying to do that thing with the tulip. The first 5 comparisons just were really lame, and you really you'll put a lot of time. That's where a lot of the time in writing it is like racking your brain to find that, well, that's not quite right. Let's try this. Let's try that, and you might change it 5 times before you publish it. So finding the right metaphor is huge. I mean, that's as big as finding the good joke for me. I mean, it's just finding a metaphor that just kind of nails it. And Rules for metaphors. I mean, I think Orwell in Politics in the English Language is really good about that. He reminds us that they should be visual or sensory in some way. They should take us away from abstraction to concreteness. You can go many different ways. If you're dealing with an abstract subject, sometimes it's great to use or a public subject, to use a very domestic metaphor. So you have to think about what realm you take them from. One of the challenges of food writing is that coming up with metaphors for food they're often gross, or they seem gross. We don't want to mix our food with all these other parts of life. So I find it's a particularly hard place to find good metaphors.
So you mentioned Orwell, Politics in the English Language, and Strunk and White. I wanted to ask, this seems like a good time, whose writing do you really admire? I notice on your syllabus there are probably a lot of people whose writing you admire. I don't know if you can narrow it down to a few.
Living writers? Living writers?
No, dead, I don't care.
Well, as I said, Thoreau's been a huge influence, both as a writer and as a thinker, even though I argue with him in almost all my books. It's very sad that he's not that read as he was when I was in college. You sort of had to read Thoreau, and I think you can get through college now without reading Thoreau. And I think it's too bad, because for prose, I think he's a great master of English prose. So he's a big person. Emerson's a big person. Nietzsche is a big person. We were just talking to Bob about that. Not for his writing so much, but just for his way of thinking. Living writers, I mentioned Janet Malcolm earlier. I think she's just a master of prose and English. As a writer, sometimes when you're stuck, one of the useful little tricks is to pick up a book of prose that you really admire and just read a few pages, just to kind of get your ear tuned again, get back in tune. And I often will pick up Edward Hoagland. I think his writing is terrific on nature, and any of his essays are worth reading. Let's see, who else? I don't read nearly as much fiction these days as I should, because I'm usually researching something. Other nonfiction writers. I'm drawing a blank. More will come, but those are the two that come to mind.
Just shout them out if they do. How are we? 2 more minutes. Maybe make this my last. So are there habits of mind that you think make for a good writer? Or what habits of mind do you think a writer needs?
Well, curiosity is the big one. Being drawn to questions more than answers, I think, is very important. When I say answers, I mean having a very kind of stable ideological view of things is not that good for writing in a lot of ways, because you have ready-made answers. So the process of arriving at answers isn't that interesting. What else? A certain obsessiveness. I mean, you have to be willing to worry a subject a lot and stick with it for a long time and see it from many points of view. So I think there's a certain obsessive compulsiveness in writers. Avidness to read. I'm kind of amazed at the journalists who I'm assigning books and long articles to journalists, how they react in horror. But I think it's really important that journalists read books. It's important everybody read books, but I think it would be good if.
Of course, you had to say that in this room.
Yeah. Other habits of mind. And I guess patience is very important too. The willingness to go over things over and over again and not get bored. I don't think, being able to go a long time without getting bored is really important, because there are periods, of disgust with your subject, of I've had enough of this. To write a book and be with the same subject for 3 or 5 years can get very depressing. And so you keep it fresh by just, passing through the boredom into another stage of interest, sneaking back up on it. So I think a certain patience and not being someone who is quick to get bored is important. And I'm not. I rarely am bored. and I think that that helps a lot.
Well, I will stop my questions here and we'll throw questions open to the audience. And will someone remind me? I need to repeat them so that they will show up on the.
I'm sorry I'm facing this way, but I don't know how to avoid it.
So.
I'd be curious to hear about your research methods and strategies, like how you organize different thoughts. Do you take note cards? Do you have binders of notes?
So a question about research methods and strategies.
I use my laptop for almost everything. I am always keeping notes, typing notes. Whenever I'm doing an article or a chapter, I have a kind of master file, which is it's everything I'm reading and thinking and talking to myself. It's kind of like a diary of the research process. Highlights from interviews, highlights from books. I'll type out, and it gets really long. It'll be like 50 single-spaced pages before I sit down to write. And some of that is because I don't have a very good memory. And I think it's one of the reasons I like essays. And I'm never going to write a biography. The idea that you could hold a whole subject in your head for years and remember the beginning of the life when you got to the end of the life is just awesome to me that people can do that. I have a very, very poor memory, and so I need to write things down. So there is that kind of document. That's kind of a key document. And then my interviews, too, which I type up. I even bring a laptop on interviews if I'm in the kind of situation where somebody would be comfortable with that. I love being able to, because I don't have, my other disability when it comes to writing, besides a bad memory, is, I'll remember this, handwriting. My handwriting is atrocious. I cannot read my handwriting after a couple days. So I need to type. I've been typing since 5th grade for that reason. Fortunately, I'm a very fast typist. So I just type everything. And now it's totally searchable. It's very easy to find things, which is very useful when you're fact-checking.
And then you outline from there.
I do outline. I make outlines that are not anything complicated with, Roman numeral 1, subhead, I or anything like that. They're really lists of things I want to get to, and I order them carefully, even though I might change the order. But there'll be a list of 12 kind of high points. And it might be a scene or it might be an idea. And if it's a scene, then I might have a subhead, which is the idea there. So it depends if I'm doing a narrative piece or more of an essayistic piece. But I do outline to know where I'm going, definitely.
This has been a talk about craft rather than content, but I came because of the content. And also circled all those allusions that you made in Gardener's Education, as I was also a beginning gardener. And then read another 30 books as a consequence. And so really helped.
Oh, that's great. I'm happy to hear that. It's heartening, especially when I'm working on the sources section of this book, that somebody will actually look at it.
Bibliography.
Yes.
So then as an activist, I wanted to just alert you to the new synthetics that are going into the
Organic.
organic.
Yeah, I'm up on that.
Perhaps ask for your comments.
Well, it's interesting. I just wrote a footnote about that today. It's funny you should bring it up. I don't know how far back I can go, but one of the subjects I've written about and I write about in this book is the industrialization of organic agriculture. Organic agriculture has changed a lot since it started. And it has been, in large part, been taken over by some large corporations with good and bad results. The good results is a lot more acreage is organic than ever was, a lot more farm workers aren't being exposed to pesticide, et cetera, et cetera. The bad results are that the organic ideal has been diluted in various ways. One of them is on this issue of processed food and synthetics. Synthetic materials like the ones I was reading, xanthan gum and ascorbic acid and all those things are actually now allowed under organic. Now, when the law was passed in 1990, creating this idea of we're going to have an official federal organic label, that law very simply said no synthetics allowed. But there was such a big industry by the time they came to make the rules 8 years later that they just put them in anyway. And they said that synthetics would be allowed in organic. And that's what gives us organic TV dinners and all sorts of organic processed foods. You would not have a big part of this organic industry without it. Then this Maine blueberry farmer named Arthur Harvey sued, said, hey, this is against the law what you're doing, and he won, to the horror of the industry. But the industry now, because it is an industry and has very powerful lobbyists, went to Congress and actually managed, using some very high-powered lobbyists, to slip into an appropriations bill. Actually, it doesn't quite happen. It's happening this week, tomorrow. A rewrite of that 1990 law on this question, allowing synthetics and even more synthetics than before. So you have to keep a really close eye on what's going on in organics these days. So, did I miss anything? Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, that's all. So that maybe when you next time you're researching, instead of the xanthan gum, you can use gum arabic, which has fascinating digressions.
Okay, you'll tell me about that later. Gum arabic.
You said that you write for a popular audience, but now you're in a university, and I'm wondering what allowances, if any, you make to embrace acting an audience, or being here, does it affect in any way your writing?
So the question is, does being here affect your writing and change the notion of your audience?
I don't think it will. It remains to be seen. I started this book before I got here, and I finished it while I was here. But I'm not interested in changing my audience. The real importance for me of being on this campus has been at the research end. The kinds of opportunities and connections I've made. And to give you an example, that thing I read at the beginning, where I go from that passage, is talking about the extent to which corn has become part of our diet and physically has become part of our bodies. That the carbon that we consist of now comes from corn in a way it didn't 50 or 100 years ago. And in the process of mentioning that to someone on campus, Ignacio Chapela, he said, well, you could prove that. I said, really? He says, yeah, go talk to Todd Dawson in integrative biology. Todd Dawson runs a mass spectrometer. And he showed me how you could take a slip of hair or a fingernail or something like that and put it through this machine and actually ascertain how much of the carbon you're physically made of came from corn plants. Well, this was astounding. And we did a McDonald's meal. And so there was this whole vista of possibility, of proof. Talk about getting past words. Here was these assertions I was making. We could actually nail it down with the help of this machine and this laboratory. So that's been a really wonderful thing. I also have the opportunity of consulting with people like that when I'm trying to describe that process and the carbon isotopes involved. It's really complicated. And so there is this collegiality on this campus where I can copy and paste a paragraph, incredibly difficult for me, scientific passage, and send it to Todd Dawson, and he'll edit it and send it back and make sure I don't make any huge mistakes. So for me, that's a great thing about being in a university, and I think it's enriched my work already and will in the future. I'm not interested in narrowing my audience because I'm on a college campus, and just because I'm less dependent on my writing income, I still want to reach as many people as possible. I've been very fortunate in that academics in various fields have paid attention to my work, even though it wasn't academic, and that nothing flatters me more to have my books taught. And Botany of Desire has been widely adopted. The one that didn't, in a way, was A Place of My Own, which one of the things I was doing in that book was trying to address the architecture world. It's a critique of modern architecture, or kind of contemporary architecture. And I really found, although I was able to do that in other countries with that book, in America, academic architects, really, either they don't read, or, which is a good possibility, or they don't care what anyone outside their fraternity thinks. Whereas in Second Nature, I found that the community of environmental historians and people doing environmental work really would listen to somebody who was outside. And the food issue certainly is true. Architecture wasn't true. So I guess I'm interested in reaching a lot of different audiences. It's a long answer to your question.
There was another hand back here.
Thank you.
The first was in education. As someone who's also teaching writing, but a writer who synthesizes a lot of different kinds of fields, history, scientific research, literature, how do you go about, especially as a younger writer, educating yourself to write in that kind of way that brings everything together? And the second question was the role of the first person in your writing, which we talked about a little bit. How do you feel that sort of throwing away the myth
So before I repeat, which one are you going to
Yeah,
answer?
which one are you go for? Well, let me talk about the first person question.
So-
I mean, the other one's interesting too, but
So the question is just about...
I don't remember the first person. It's always going to be the latter. So the question is, the first person, is that what's gained by throwing away objectivity and things like that? Well, I'm not sure I have thrown away objectivity. I think in many ways objectivity is a myth. The omniscience of the third person journalist especially is a myth. It's a convention. And there are many ways to write very opinionated, pointed things under the, but still stick to New York Times front page style. Judith Miller is a classic case in point. She didn't use the first person, but we were getting her view of the world and the various spook types she talks to, not an objective view of the world. You can promulgate a lot of lies in the objective third person. One of the things I learned working with Lewis Lapham at Harper's, and one of the most valuable, is whenever I got a piece and I was editing it, the one thing he'd always want me to get in the first few paragraphs is, who is this person and where are they coming from? He had no patience for that omniscient voice. And if you look at Harper's compared to, say, the Atlantic, which is a lot more comfortable with that omniscient voice, less so now, but certainly when I was at Harper's, you'll see a real difference. They kind of gravitate toward a social scientific point of view, whereas Harper's is much more humanistic, the writer point of view. They're very different ways of construing journalism and reality. So, the danger with the first person is that it becomes incredibly narcissistic and that you end up writing about yourself. I think you'll find if you look at the way I use the first person, it's actually remarkable how little I reveal about myself. It's bits and pieces, but it's really a tool. I see it as a tool to kind of bring the reader in and to look at the world from a certain perspective, not so much as that I really want to write about myself. So, there's a tradition in journalism that regards it as self-indulgent. But I actually think you could make a case that the alternative to the first person that we have is much more megalomaniacal, in that the pretense to knowing that is there is just astounding. So that's where I am on that.
Time for one more?
Back that way.
Oh,
I would like just to ask about your outreach. I guess, first of all, what's your ultimate goal in writing? If you are an idealist and if you want that things change and you have a better food system in the States, if that's part of your goal when you write. And secondly, I would like to ask you if you don't, with Botany of Desire, which I've read, if you don't have some feedbacks somehow that you have generated some monsters in the sense people who deal with food like only and not in a more profound way. Like I'm Italian and sometimes I see these drawbacks of people who deal with food like it's a sort of a religion. Do you have that sort of negative feedback
Yeah.
from your readers? I mean, negative from my point of view.
so the two questions. Now, you're
Do you
rubbing
remember?
off on
Please
me.
remind me.
First one is what the ultimate goal in your writing, and the second one is feedback, especially from Botany of Desire. Are you making a big thing out of
A small thing. It's food, overplaying food. They're both really good questions. It's funny. One of my first days when I got to the journalism school, there was this orientation, and the whole faculty was standing there talking to the new students, it was for prospective students. And one of my colleagues, esteemed colleagues, whose name I won't mention, gets up and says, "Well, I hope you haven't come here because you want to change the world." That's not what journalism is about. And I was like, "Oh shit! I came to the wrong place." Because I think fundamentally, if you're writing nonfiction, or at least the kind I am, you do want to change the world, or at least push it in a certain direction a little bit. When I talked about my interest in nature and our place in nature, I mean, I want to change what people think. That's changing the world. It's political to try to change what people think, even if you're writing something that isn't espousing a political position or an ideology. I mean, you're trying to displace where people are, where they're starting from, move their starting point a little bit. So I actually think it's inevitable. I think, in a narrow sense, writing with a political agenda all the time is a problem for journalists, or can be. So I do think that. I mean, there are things I've written that don't have any kind of politics in this very broad sense, that are strictly for, have other purposes. But in general, everything is kind of, I think, you're trying to change what people think. So that's one core belief. On the food issue, there are people in Berkeley who overestimate the importance of food. I'm willing to grant that. But in most of the rest of the country, this isn't a big problem. And in fact, one of the challenges of living here and writing about this subject is not falling into the level of obsession and sophistication about food that you find here. That I have to remember that you've got to earn people's attention to this, that they don't understand that it is one of the most important political issues there is, in fact, which I believe is true. But not everybody knows this yet. But yeah, there is a kind of, obsession about food and overvaluation perhaps of the aesthetics of it. But I even think the aesthetics have a kind of political dimension to it. I'm a big fan of slow food, and that I think they've kind of squared the circle in a nice way of showing how connoisseurship actually can have a politics. If you sensitize people's taste, you can make them intolerant of a Big Mac, and that's a positive thing. I mean, that you don't get pleasure. I mean, if you start learning about food and eating really good fresh food, well prepared, you can't enjoy fast food anymore. It's too salty. It leaves you feeling disgusted. And I think that that's kind of good. So I'm not so worried about that problem. I mean, I meet people all the time that don't always see the connections of their connoisseurship or their foodieism in a larger context, that it has important ecological and political ramifications. And it's very important that the whole elitism and effetism of food, not be allowed to take over. But I think food is a very important issue. It's much more important than most people recognize. And it's connected to so many other issues about the way our society works and public health and the environment. It's our largest impact on the planet is the way we feed ourselves. And I don't think we're in danger of overestimating it.
I think that's where we should stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.